Imagine receiving a life sentence, locked away in a massive, fortified prison. A towering, impenetrable wall surrounds you, reinforced with iron and concrete. There's no way through it, no way under it. The only way out is through the gates, but those gates never open for men like you. Would you accept your fate, resigned to spend the rest of your days in captivity? Or would you fight against the impossible, daring to defy the system? Today, we dive into the story of two prisoners who refused to give in. They were hardened criminals, sentenced to life behind bars. Yet, despite failed attempts, insurmountable obstacles, and the relentless vigilance of guards, they continued to plot, scheming the most elaborate and daring escape plan ever conceived. Welcome to the Clinton Correctional Facility, better known as the Dannemora Prison, located in the remote, mountainous regions of northern New York. It is one of the most heavily guarded maximum security prisons in America, a fortress designed to house only the most dangerous criminals, men for whom there is no second chance. Most prisons of this caliber are built in isolated locations, far from civilian life. But Dannemora is different. It stands in the middle of a small town of just 5,000 residents, a silent giant casting its shadow over everyday life. The prison's walls stretch 9 meters high, so tall that scaling them is out of the question. And even if a prisoner managed to reach the top, the 2-meter-thick concrete, reinforced with iron bars, makes any attempt to break through futile. Guard towers loom above, manned by armed officers who maintain constant surveillance, and beneath the prison, solid mountain rock, eliminating any hope of tunneling out. Escape is impossible. At least, that's what they thought. Our first prisoner is Richard Matt, a ruthless murderer who earned the chilling nickname the Saw. In 1997, he kidnapped his former boss, shoved him into the trunk of a car, and drove for 24 hours, stopping only to beat and torture the elderly man, demanding money that didn't exist. When his victim finally succumbed to his injuries, Richard didn't stop there. He dragged the body to a secluded cabin, dismembered it with a saw, and disposed of the remains in the Niagara River. After fleeing to Mexico, Richard continued his violent spree, murdering another man. But this time, he was caught. Imprisoned in Mexico for 9 years, he was eventually extradited to the U.S., where he was sentenced to life in Dannemora. 7 years passed, but Richard's mind never left one thought: escape. Every time his family visited, his daughter would later recall, he spoke of nothing else. His obsession consumed him. But Richard knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a partner, someone with the skills to make the impossible possible. And he found that person in the next cell, David Sweat. David Sweat was a career criminal, in and out of prison from a young age. His most notorious crime? The cold-blooded murder of a police chief. This act sealed his fate. Life in Dannemora, no chance of parole. But David wasn't just another prisoner. Over the years, he had honed a unique set of skills. Working in the prison's various workshops, he learned electrical work, metal fabrication, carpentry, and blacksmithing. The prison relied on inmates for maintenance, unknowingly arming some of them with knowledge that could be turned against it. Together, Richard and David formed the perfect team. Richard was the manipulator, the mastermind. David was the engineer, the man who could turn ideas into reality. And so, they began to plan. Their goal: escape through the western side of the prison, the farthest point from the watchtowers. But they faced two immediate problems: how to unlock their cells and how to get over the wall. Step 1. Open the cell doors. The locks were secured with special screws requiring a Torx bit, a tool not found in any prison workshop. They would need help from the outside. Richard knew exactly who to target: Joyce Mitchell, the head of the prison's sewing workshop. Joyce was in her late 40s, trapped in an unhappy marriage. Vulnerable, lonely, the perfect target. Richard, a master manipulator, charmed his way into her life. He showered her with attention, making her feel special, desired. Slowly, he reeled her in, asking for small favors. Nothing alarming at first. A pair of glasses with LED lights to help him read at night after lights out. She complied. More small requests followed, each one pulling her deeper into his web. But asking for a torque spit was different. If Joyce refused, she could expose them. Richard needed leverage, something to ensure her silence. He convinced her to send him intimate photos. At first, she resisted, but Richard was relentless, playing on her emotions, her insecurities, her need to feel wanted. Eventually, she gave in, and just like that, Richard had her in his grasp. If she ever betrayed him, he had the perfect weapon against her. With the blackmail in place, he made his real request, the Torx bit. Joyce, now too afraid to refuse, smuggled it into the sewing workshop and handed it over. But getting the tool was only half the battle. Now Richard had to sneak it into his cell without being detected. Prisoners were searched with metal detectors before leaving the workshop. There was no way to hide it on his body. But Richard had a plan. He owned a pair of headphones, one of the few personal electronics allowed in prison. And he knew that inside those headphones was metal, enough to trigger the detector. And so, as he walked through the checkpoint, he palmed the Torx bit and held his headphones in his other hand. When the scanner beeped, the guards checked the headphones, found the internal wiring, and dismissed the alert. The screwdriver was in. The first step of their escape was complete. And this was only the beginning. Richard carefully hid the screwdriver bit inside an empty compartment in his headphones. With this clever trick, he passed through the routine searches and exited the workshop undetected. Once he returned to his cell, he discreetly handed the bit over to his neighbor, David Sweat. David immediately set to work, attempting to unscrew the lock bolts on his cell door. For several days, both men took turns trying to loosen the screws, but no matter how much effort they put in, the plan failed. Their first attempt at escape had hit a dead end. However, surrender was never an option. Instead of giving up, Richard and David became even more determined. They needed a new plan, and fast. That's when David had an idea. If they couldn't escape through the doors, they would find another way out. His eyes landed on the vent in the back wall of the cell. Every prison cell had one, and David knew that if he could remove it, he would gain access to an area known as the catwalks, a hidden passage running behind the cells where power lines and ventilation pipes were housed. Fortunately, David had been inside the catwalks before. As an inmate assigned to electrical maintenance, he had seen the back extensions firsthand. Now, all he needed was a tool to cut through the vent cover. It was Richard's turn to secure the necessary equipment. They needed a sharp cutting tool, and Richard immediately thought of Joyce. He asked her to smuggle in hacksaw blades, but unlike the small screwdriver bit, the blades were too large to hide in his headphones. That's when Richard turned to his second inside ally. Jean Palmer, a prison guard supervisor, had an unofficial understanding with Richard. In exchange for maintaining order in the ward, Richard enjoyed certain privileges. While Jean would never knowingly help smuggle escape tools, Richard leveraged their friendship to leave the sewing workshop without being searched. When Joyce delivered the hacksaw blades, Richard took them into the bathroom, taped them to his chest, and feigned severe stomach pain. According to protocol, a sick prisoner would be escorted back to his cell after a search, but Richard's escort was Jean. Trusting their arrangement, Jean bypassed the metal detector, unknowingly allowing Richard to smuggle the blades into his cell. Richard handed a set of blades to David, and both men began cutting through the vent covers at the back of their cells. They worked only during noisy times, when televisions blared, prisoners played cards, or others worked in the kitchen, ensuring that the sound of the saw wouldn't raise suspicion. After 3 weeks, David successfully removed his vent cover, while Richard was still making progress. But before David could crawl through, he had to ensure no one noticed his absence. He stuffed clothes under his blanket, shaping them to resemble a sleeping body. Since prisoners in New York were allowed to cover themselves completely while sleeping, this trick would go unnoticed during nightly bed checks. Meanwhile, Richard kept watch, ready to distract any guard who came too close. Once the final head count was completed and the lights went out, David slipped through the opening and into the catwalks. He crawled through the narrow passage, eventually reaching a ladder that led down to the underground tunnels. These tunnels were an expansive network beneath the prison, carrying massive steam pipes used for heating and water distribution. The problem? The tunnels were vast, unpartitioned, and seemingly endless. David explored them night after night, searching for an exit, but his hope began to fade. The tunnels, though interconnected, were completely sealed off. There was no direct way out. After a week of exploration, Richard finally removed his vent cover. But rather than both of them searching, they agreed that David, being slimmer and more agile, would continue alone. Richard, heavier and slower, would stay behind as lookout. Frustration mounted as each night yielded no results. Then an idea struck them. The prison's power station, located 200 meters outside the facility walls, supplied both electricity and steam. If David could locate the steam pipes leading from the prison to the station, he might have found their way out. For several nights, David followed the pipes, tracing them deep into the tunnels. Eventually, he reached a wall where the pipes passed through, a promising lead. To his relief, it wasn't the thick prison wall. Unlike the heavily fortified walls above ground, this underground structure was merely a standard concrete partition. Though he had no digging tools, David began chiseling away at the mortar with his hacksaw blades. It was painstakingly slow, but progress was possible. Then, fate intervened. One night, while making his way through the tunnel, David stumbled upon a large red toolbox, an unexpected jackpot. Maintenance workers had left it behind, trusting that no prisoners could access this area. Inside, David found exactly what he needed, a hammer. With this new tool, his digging efforts accelerated. For 2 weeks, he chipped away at the concrete until he finally broke through. Elated, he squeezed through the opening, only to be met with crushing disappointment. Another wall stood in his way. This time, it was no ordinary wall, it was the outer prison wall, a massive 2-meter-thick fortress. David stood frozen in shock. Had all their effort been for nothing? Returning to his cell, he broke the news to Richard. Instead of despairing, the two men made a bold decision. They would keep digging no matter how long it took, even if it took decades. They even laughed, comparing their mission to The Shawshank Redemption, where the protagonist spent 20 years tunneling out of prison. Each night, they took turns chiseling away at the wall. The process was brutally slow, and their morale wavered. Hours of effort resulted in only minor progress. The sheer thickness of the wall made their goal seem impossible. Then, one night, as David rummaged through the red toolbox, his eyes widened in disbelief. Nestled among the tools was a drilling machine. Their hope was reignited. But as he lifted the drill, his excitement quickly faded. It was missing a drill bit. David returned to his cell and immediately told Richard the news. Richard was thrilled and wasted no time devising a plan to smuggle in a drill bit, something they desperately needed. The first person who came to mind was Joyce. By now, she was more than just an accomplice. She was a full-fledged partner in their escape plan. She had even agreed to wait for them outside the prison in her car, ready to drive them straight to Mexico, where they would start a new life. Richard had no doubt Joyce could get her hands on the drill bit, but the real challenge was smuggling it into the prison. After careful thought, he found the perfect solution. While prisoners were allowed to buy food from the cafeteria, raw food was strictly prohibited. However, it was an open secret that guards often turned a blind eye for inmates they trusted, especially when it came to smuggling in raw meat. And Richard had just the right person for the job. Gene Palmer, a prison guard he had built a solid friendship with. Richard instructed Joyce to hide the drill bits inside raw meat, freeze them, and then hand them over to Gene, who would unknowingly deliver them straight to Richard. And that's exactly what happened. Joyce followed his plan to the letter. Gene, thinking he was simply bending the rules for a friend, handed over the frozen meat, completely unaware that he was aiding in an escape. That night, David descended into the tunnel, his heart pounding with excitement. The real digging could finally begin. But his excitement quickly turned to dread. The red toolbox, their only source of proper tools, was gone. Vanished. David felt like the universe was conspiring against him. Frustrated but determined, he returned to the cell. The only tool left was the hammer, which had been lying next to the missing box. Richard and David knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to press forward, no matter what. And so, with nothing but sheer willpower, they continued hacking away at the wall, chipping at it night after night. Then, on May 4th, 2015, something extraordinary happened. For weeks, they had been digging near a set of hot steam pipes, their intense heat a constant reminder of the prison's heating system. But that night, David noticed something strange. There was no heat. The pipes were cold. He realized the prison had shut off the steam for the summer, meaning these massive pipes were now nothing more than empty tunnels. One pipe in particular caught his attention, a large one with a 60-centimeter diameter. It was tight, but just big enough for him to squeeze through. Richard, however, was a different story. Even after losing weight, the fit would be extremely difficult. But this pipe was their way out. Richard knew what he had to do. From that moment on, he drastically cut his food intake, surviving almost entirely on water. Meanwhile, David worked every night, slowly sawing through the pipe using the hacksaw blades they had smuggled in. It was grueling, slow, and dangerous, but after a week of relentless effort, he finally cut an opening. When David crawled inside, he confirmed what he had hoped. The pipe extended through the thick, impenetrable outer wall of the prison. They had finally found their exit. But there was still one major problem. To truly escape, David needed to cut another hole on the other side of the wall. This meant crawling through the narrow, suffocating pipe and somehow managing to saw it open from the inside, a task that seemed almost impossible. Yet he refused to give up. Night after night, David squeezed through the pipe, barely able to move, and kept sawing away at the thick metal. It took 3 agonizing weeks, but at last he broke through. When he climbed out, he found himself in a dark tunnel. He had done it. He had crossed the massive prison wall. But where exactly was he? As he moved forward, the answer hit him, not by sight, but by smell. The overwhelming stench made it clear. He had entered the town's sewage system. For the first time in his life, David was grateful for such a disgusting odor. It meant freedom. He followed the tunnel until he spotted a ladder leading up to a manhole. Climbing up, he carefully lifted the cover and peeked outside. there it was, the town's empty streets just a few steps away. For a split second, he considered escaping alone, leaving Richard behind. But after taking a deep breath, he calmed himself, shut the cover, and returned to his cell. The next morning, Richard was overjoyed by the news. The two of them wasted no time making final preparations. Richard informed Joyce of their escape plan. At exactly 11:30 p.m. that night, they would emerge from the sewer, and she needed to be there waiting for them in her car. But what they didn't know was that Joyce had been consumed by fear. The pressure of the escape had become too much, and instead of showing up that night, she checked herself into a hospital. At 11:30 p.m. on June 6, 2015, Richard and David left their cells, placing stuffed clothing under their blankets to make it look like they were still asleep. They moved swiftly through the tunnels until they reached the pipe. David went through easily. Richard, despite weeks of starving himself, got stuck. Panic set in. He thrashed, struggled, and worst of all, started yelling. David, terrified that they'd be discovered, urged him to stay quiet. Thinking fast, he tossed Richard a bedsheet and pulled him through with all his strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard squeezed through. Miraculously, no one had heard them. Reaching the ladder, David climbed up and cautiously lifted the manhole cover, scanning the area for Joyce's car. His heart sank. She wasn't there. He went back down and told Richard, who insisted they wait a little longer. But as the minutes passed, their window of escape was closing. By 5 a.m., the morning roll call would expose their disappearance. By midnight, it was clear. Joyce had abandoned them. They had no choice but to run. At dawn, the prison erupted into chaos. Guards discovered the empty cells, the tunnels, and the gaping holes in the walls. Alarms blared. Within hours, the media swarmed the prison, and even the governor of New York arrived, personally inspecting the escape route. A manhunt of unprecedented scale was launched. Over 1,500 officers, FBI agents, forest rangers, and law enforcement agencies combed through every possible hiding place. Checkpoints were set up. Helicopters patrolled the skies. Meanwhile, Richard and David had reached the dense forests surrounding the area. Knowing they'd be easier to track together, they made a desperate decision. They split up. For 21 days, authorities searched every inch of the region. Then, on June 26, 2015, they found Richard. He was 80 kilometers from the prison, holed up in an abandoned hunting cabin. When the police surrounded him, Richard grabbed a gun and aimed it at them. They fired. Only later did they realize the gun had been empty. 2 days later, on June 28, 2015, David tried to cross into Canada. A border officer recognized him, drew his weapon, and ordered him to stop. Instead, David bolted. The officer fired, hitting him in the leg. The chase was over. After 23 days on the run, Richard was dead, and David was in custody. During interrogation, David confessed everything: how they planned the escape, how they executed it, and who had helped them. Joyce Mitchell and guard Gene Balmer were both arrested. David received an additional life sentence. To this day, he remains in prison. Joyce was sentenced to 4 years and fined $86,000. Gene, who had unknowingly aided their escape, was sentenced to 6 months and fined $5,000. And so, the greatest prison escape in New York's history came to an end. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe our channel for more videos.